welcome John W. Evans to our little happy hour chat. It's been quite a while since we've spoken, so it's just nice to see you again, first and foremost.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you.
And I've been snooping around your website, and I see that you have recently finished a novel, so I'm chomping on the bit to ask you about that. And very, very interested in, for various reasons, in like what that kind of slide and push was against between memoir and novel writing. But we have a bumper crowd here tonight, primarily, I think, because you're a memoirist. There are lots of memoirists with us.
Oh, very cool.
So I thought we'd start there, because that's where you've been writing most in the past.
Perfect.
Tell me how you got into it, in the sense of, I know that you had a story that you wanted to tell, but what made you decide that you actually wanted to tell it publicly? Because I imagine that's a big thing for memoirists is, do I want to make this public or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I was trained as a poet. I did all my studying as a poet. I did undergraduate and graduate as a poet, graduate work as a poet, and I came out to Stanford on a fellowship as a poet. And I sort of believe that part of the answer to your question is that, first thing I wrote were elegies. And I about 6 weeks after my first wife passed, I had moved back to Indiana, was living with her brother and his family. And I started writing these poems that were just, my whole idea was, I got an email from a person, a wonderful, wonderful human being and a wonderful teacher. And of course, I took it to mean probably absolutely what he didn't mean. But he wrote and he said, John, God, there are no words for what you are going through. And it made me feel so ambitious and angry, because I was like, no, there's going to be words. Believe, something is going to be said. And, I had just started a very personal, private, small blog that I was trying to post photographs. And I thought, I could sustain a community around Katie's memory. But I was also so emotionally overwhelmed and kind of broken by the experience that I would find myself just grieving all the time. And I think also sort of traumatized by what had happened. And I just one night had received all of these photos back from Walgreens of Katie and I that was on her phone. And I finally kind of worked up the courage to go get those developed. And I brought them home and I just started sobbing. And I just did not like that reaction at all. It made me feel so helpless to feel that way. And I sat down and I just wrote, there are no words. and I just wrote like the first grief poem I'd ever written. I mean, I had always thought I was going to be the happily married Peace Corps poet. Like that was always sort of my identity. And I was always writing about being a Peace Corps volunteer and traveling. So anyway, I sort of felt like when this tragedy happened, I had a little bit of practice at knowing how to be maybe a little thoughtful and eloquent or good with words. But over the next year, I just started writing these poems, and I just sort of said, like, I'm going to get every month down on the page. I'm just, whatever else I do. I was teaching part-time. I was going to therapy a lot. I was hanging out with my nieces and nephews and my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law. But I just thought, whatever else I do in this very stripped down version of myself, I'm going to write a poem every month, and I'm going to have a record of what this felt like. And that felt very taboo. It felt very, very taboo to write about Katie's death. And then people really started responding to those poems, families and family members and friends. And that practice, that ritual of writing poems became very meaningful to me. I would just post them on the blog, share them with family members and friends. And someone somewhere read the blog and said, hey, could we publish a couple of those? And I sent the poems to them. And that was very validating. And then I thought, oh my gosh, okay, well, I'm going to send out more of these poems. And I started sending out, put all the Peace Corps poems to the side and started sending out the elegies, which were raw, often not very polished poems. They were very urgently written, and those started finding readers. And one thing led to another, and I got this fellowship, and I came out to California, and I was madly in love again, and with an old friend of Katie's and I's, and it just everything in the world just felt like it was, all the lights had turned green and things were wonderful and happy, and we got married and we had our first son, and somewhere about 3.5 years out, I found myself writing these poems and thinking, I might be a big phony. Like, what do I have to grieve about? My life is happy. I have had some sequences in my life that have led to new experiences and new places and new peoples. And who am I to still be thinking about grief? And I shared this with my boss at the time, Van Bolen, the Irish poet who just passed a couple months ago, very tragically, very sadly, a huge loss for all of us. And Van said, she was very unsentimental. She was very Irish, and she said, well, have you thought about writing prose, John? And I said, well, I've never taken a prose writing class in my life. What would I possibly have to say? She said, oh, poets write memoirs all the time. This is not you. She had a wonderful way of making you feel very stupid for doubting yourself. And she said, you'll just write it down and just see what happened, because I would write these poems where what I was feeling in my heart was, oh my God, I'm a dad and I'm in love and life is happy and California has figs. And then on the page I would be saying, in Indiana, the snow is melting on the, I just felt like such a phony. And anyway, to answer your question finally, Sharon, what I found was, the thing I had not written about was Katie's death. And the reason I'd written in response to it, I had described my feelings, but I'd never written down the sequence of events around Katie's death. And I thought, why is that? And I thought, oh, because that's taboo. That's just straight up profiteering, John. You're just going to write about this because you want to have something to write about. And so I sat down and I wrote a piece about saying, gosh, I kind of think I'm a phony. I used to write elegies. And now I wonder, am I just kind of running the line out here? Am I just sort of doing it because I can, but there's not much to say? And in asking those questions and being honest with myself, I found myself start to talk very broad strokes about the circumstances of Katie's death. And that led to, for the first time in about 1.5 years, all of those feelings coming back. I mean, just a complete renewal of a lot of the intense feelings I'd had about Katie's death. And I kind of started to think, oh, this is interesting. There's something here that I'm being drawn to write towards and think about and feel and wonder about. And I just thought, I finished it and I thought, wow, I don't know that I've made any sense, but I have honestly engaged this question and I have held myself to task and I've written about this. And the next thought I had was, okay, well, I didn't come up with an answer, but I wrote something that was good. I know that. So I thought, well, what other questions do I want to ask? And I said, why are you having problems sleeping? Why is sleep such an issue for you? You're 4 years out, you've got a baby, you've got, what are you doing still bothering with your sleep? And so I started writing about sleep. And then that became a piece. And then I just started writing about things related to Katie's death. But my method was really weird. My method was, I don't think I have them here anymore, but I had a stack of about 15 memoirs that I liked. And I read them all. And then I would just pull one. When I wanted to do something Tim O'Brien did, I'd pull Tim O'Brien down, I'd open it up, I'd find the passage, I would find the feeling, and then I would start writing, and I'd put that down. And then I would pick up Vera Brittain. Then I would pick up Joan Didion. Then I would pick up Robert Graves. Then I would pick up, what's her name? Alexandra Styron had just written an amazing memoir about her father's death and her experience of trauma with him. And I just started almost like kind of having a conversation with these books, but sort of using them to inspire myself to write. And over a span of about 6 months, I wrote 30,000 words or so doing that.
Yeah.
And I just sort of sat with it and I thought, oh, well, this is not one essay, but this is not a book. And I kind of put it aside for a while and kind of left and tried to get my head together. And then that fall, I just said, well, what if you finish the book? What's the worst thing that would happen if you just finished writing a book? It's probably not any good. It's probably not going to become anything. But it does emotionally satisfy something in me. It helps me understand something and think about something. And I also just had confidence that some parts of it were very good, even if it wasn't meant for anyone. And so I just worked at this subject matter. And the question that came forward for me that was really interesting was, I don't feel grief. Grief is a temporary state. I've gone through grief. Swinburne has a line in his poem, time remembered is grief forgotten. The chorus in Atalanta, he says, time remembered is grief forgotten. As soon as you get to the process of memory, you're doing narrative work. You're replacing the grief with narrative writing. I thought, okay, I know grief. Joan Didion told me grief is a temporary state. I'm 5 years out now. So what am I writing about? And I thought, guilt. I'm writing about guilt, and not survivor's guilt. I'm writing about guilt that, you know, this was the guy she spent the end of her life with. This was the guy who didn't save her life. This is the guy who cashed her insurance check and then moved to California. You know, and I just started to really write about guilt, and that was enough. That helped me finish the book. You know, I just realized, oh, I've written poems about grief. What I haven't written about is guilt. And I had the good fortune. I mean, I didn't tell anyone I was writing a memoir. I was the poetry guy. I was a poet, you know, but I could do something in memoir that felt so direct and vivid and visceral. And I was in bad shape, but when the work was done, I understood something about myself. I didn't like what I understood, but I understood something about myself. I felt something. And then, you know, then I finished it. And then I had the thought, well, do I want to try and publish this? Or do I want to just say that's enough? And I have those of you who've taken a class with me or two have heard me say this before, so I apologize. But I have a very plain feeling about memoir, which is that it is fundamentally private work, but we all want to ultimately share it once we're done doing the work. So I thought about it. I shared it with a couple of people, but not very many people. And then I just started sending it out and just seeing if anybody wanted to publish it. And it found its way to a publisher. It found its way to a contest and found its way to a publisher. And that was, but, you know, it was really just that thought of like, I couldn't write about the facts of Katie's death in poetry. I couldn't write about insurance money in my poetry. I couldn't spend a lot of time imagining, you know, well, what if we just had just taken the lift instead of hiking up the mountain? What would have happened that day? And I couldn't hold myself to account in poetry without having to think about line breaks and musicality and all these things that I've been trained to think about as a poet. But I was fortunate to have almost no training as a prose writer. So I didn't think there was really anything except that I just had to say things that were true and just be honest. And it plays very, I mean, I'm Catholic, I'm from the Midwest, so it plays very well to my deeply self-indicting tendencies as a person. So in that way, the form worked really well for me. But I honestly feel, and I'm not, you know, you're not paying me to be here. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I just strongly believe anybody can write a memoir. Anyone can do it. It doesn't, you don't need to have a plan. You don't need to have you can just sit down and write. And I'm sure you have other questions, so I don't want to waste all of your time. But I mean, there are basic questions of memoir that can start any of us on that path. And they're you know, you just start writing towards those questions and you'll know, you know, whether you have something to say or not.